Hello, everybody. We are live. Welcome back to CUI Hotline. This week, in lieu of the wonderful Jacob Horn, I have Patrick and Vadim. Patrick from our product management team and Vadim from our technical migration team. We're going to get into the bowels of technical questions this week. So feel free to still ask compliance. I'll be responding to those. But I thought it's time to get some real experts on the line, which is why I recruited Patrick and Vadim here. Guys, pleasure to have you. Give us a little intro. Tell us about yourselves.
Yeah. Hey, guys. Patrick Abel. I've been an architect with Summit 7 for quite some time. Recent transition to product management focused around our cloud platforms.
Hey, everybody. Vadim Sushchik here, the migration team lead and architect. Background is in system administration, Exchange, and the M365 stack. Been doing migrations since about 2015, AD and Exchange migrations. So
many moons, Vadim.
Yeah.
Well, I know we have a little bit of a weekend review. Patrick, you've had an interesting week. There's some new releases around cross-cloud. Can you tell the people a little bit about what that is and what some of the new things coming out that they should be paying attention to?
Yeah, sure. So yesterday, Microsoft put out an article to formally announce that cross-cloud, cross-tenant sync is now in public preview. This cross-tenant sync relates to B2B collaboration between tenants. So especially for organizations that have multiple tenants and are collaborating between them. So, think an enclave in GCC High, but a parent company that's in like commercial, the need to be able to automate and synchronize guest users between them. Cross-tenant sync is how you've been able to do that in the Microsoft platform. But until now, you couldn't do it across cloud boundaries. So you couldn't do it between Azure Government and Azure Commercial. You were limited to just, GCC High to GCC High or vice versa. So this new capability is quite an enabler. This means that you can sync user attributes between tenants for sake of dynamic group membership, birthright access to guests and tenants such that, they don't have to be invited. They don't have to have invitations redeemed. Just kind of smoothing out the life cycle for users.
See, that's nice because so many times, I mean, how many hoops did you have to jump through to get an identity over here to look like a guest identity in GCC High? And it's like, now this has some level of automation because when you offboard somebody over here, it doesn't mean you're offboarding them in the other tenant, right? And it's like, I don't want Joe to still exist in GCC High when I offboarded him in commercial. So I'm very happy this is available from Microsoft. This has been in the works I feel like I've heard rumors of this for a long time. I'm happy they're finally like launching in private preview. Any idea on GA? Have they said anything about when they think it'll be GA? Is it
I haven't seen a date. But I mean, lately the gap between public preview and GA is pretty tight, 3 or 4 months. So I haven't seen, I have to check the roadmap, but yeah, exciting stuff.
That's awesome. Well, in my weekend review, I've had the privilege of talking to some more higher ed this week. And the question that keeps getting brought up is who owns CMMC and the journey to get there in higher ed? Because I can tell you right now, everybody I talk to, it's a game of hot potato. Does the CIO's office own it? Does each school or department own it? Like who actually owns this thing, right? Because it's one of those things that's so hairy, so complicated, like nobody wants to touch it. No one wants to be liable. And then Georgia Tech came out, right? Georgia Tech scared everyone because of false claims. Penn State, right? Again, scares everyone for putting their name on a Spurs score. So again, it's just kind of one of those really interesting things where it has to get done. And in an organization like higher ed, the governance requirement of non-US persons, when you have grad students a lot of times that are non-US persons, again, the ownership of who does the journey, who controls the labs, is it pooled per division, department, et cetera. Anyways, always kind of interesting. There is no right answer. What we've seen most people doing is the CIO's office ultimately has to step in and deal with that, which, is additional burden and strain on them because shared services in that world typically can't support the regulated piece, right? So then you have like a group under shared services that can support them. And anyways, it gets really fun, really complicated very fast. If you're in the regulated space, feel free to drop us a comment or note. I'm curious on who owns it in your journey. We might need to have some sort of, happy hour to celebrate how regulated research is actually doing this well. So, Patrick, I know you mentioned it just a little bit. I'm going to pivot here for just a second. Cross-cloud from an identity perspective, you mentioned. What exactly is it from a collaboration perspective? Like, what can I do outside of just have my identity present?
Yeah, sure. So, from a capability standpoint, when we say, cross-tenant collaboration or cross-cloud collaboration, we're really talking about a guest user being able to be invited and collaborating in your tenant. Some of that has to do with kind of where that user comes from. So the ability to collaborate with a guest that comes from a lot of different contexts. So, same cloud, like GCC High to GCC High kind of collaboration, cross cloud, so across, commercial and GCC High, and then even accommodating like guest access across users that are outside the Microsoft ecosystem altogether. But that the ability to collaborate extends to really, most of the collaborative workload. So, that guest being able to be within a SharePoint site, within Teams, threaded chat, being able to collaborate in that context, Planner, Power BI, things like that. And then generally when we're talking about cross-tenant collaboration, there's some other use cases. Some of that is a guest coming to you to collaborate, but sometimes it's just talking between tenants. Federated chat from my tenant to your tenant so that we're just able to chat seamlessly, or things like calendar sharing, able to see free busy, ways to just have a multi-tenant organization and cleanly collaborate between those tenants.
Is there anything, so that requires basically a trust or a federation set up between your tenant and like a subcontractor's tenant?
Yeah.
Is there anything that I can do and collaborate without having that bridge in place? I know you mentioned federated chat. Is that just available without having to build that trust between the two tenants?
It is. Federation, the federated chat, it actually uses Skype for Business as a backend, effectively still those same protocols. But yeah, you can chat via federated chat between tenants. It's a good question because a lot the one rub that we see when collaborating between tenants that sit in different clouds, so like commercial to GCC High, is that it requires kind of a handshake between tenants. So, the tenant let's say a user's coming from commercial to GCC High to collaborate. From the GCC High side, you have to allow that user inbound from a partner relationship between tenants. And from the commercial side, they have to allow that user outbound to your tenant. So it kind of requires that setup. It's a real lightweight thing to do, but it does have to happen. So generally, without that, if a customer were to not want to do that, you either are just chatting with federated chat between tenants because that doesn't require it. The other thing that Microsoft has made available is now you can just create guest users. They still are treated like guests. They're still governed like guests. All of the same controls can be attributed. They don't have to be licensed, but you're able to see them from your tenant. You don't have to invite them where there might be some cross-cloud dependencies. So
interesting. Yeah. So the good news is you can do it without having to go through all the steps. But if you really want to do it well, I was having this conversation with somebody the other day. It's like cross-cloud functionality is fantastic. However, you have to meet with your supply chain program because you have to know if who you're connecting to on a technology perspective can actually accept and has accepted the flow down for CUI protection. Like you can't just let anybody in there, right? Even though it's available and from a technical, you can do that all day long. You still have to put the governance in place before you even open up that hole, basically, right?
Yeah. Well, and you've got, typically that's, interconnectivity agreements, contractual flow downs, things like that between partners. But yeah, if you're inviting a guest user, they're coming in from an endpoint that you don't control, you don't govern. And so, we typically will leverage Defender for Cloud Apps to kind of mediate or proxy that browser-based experience, control things like copy, paste, print, upload, download. So definitely good controls to do that in the M365 stack. So.
Sweet. All right. I think Scott had a comment here about a regulated research. Most of this follows grants in the department that owns the grant. They then look to IT, and I've seen a lot of issues with the few I've been involved in. Yeah, same thing. It's like the PI, the principal investigator, they're kind of owning that vehicle, and they're pointing to shared IT inside the university saying, hey, make sure we're DFARS compliant, right? And it's like, that doesn't really work as easily as people want it to. But the problem is, it's kind of a catch-22. If the PIs go somewhere else and they take their grant and research money away from the university isn't like that. It's dollars that they're not getting in their pocket, if you will. And so there's a significant cost in making sure that that is done well, so you can attract and continue to attract really good talent that they can actually confidently bring you their grant and research dollars. Because if they can't do it in a compliant way, they've really got to go somewhere else, which is never fun. All right. Let's see here. I think Vadim's video was messing up. Vadim, can you hear us?
Yes, sir. I'm back.
All right. We got the audio, so now you just get to look at Patrick and I's pretty face here. One of the things we wanted to hit really big on, today, and you can feel free to ask any other questions you might have, is around the technical and the user experience when going to a different Microsoft tenant, specifically the GovCloud. These are questions that we get on a daily basis. What works? What doesn't work? What's the user impact? What can I no longer do from a compliance perspective or technology, right? So Vadim, as mentioned earlier, he leads our migration practice here. And the first question out of the gate that every technical person wants to ask, because their executives are asking them, what is the user impact, Vadim? I make it to a migration cutover weekend. I'm now living in GCC High. My users show up Monday morning. What are they going to have to do differently or set up, at least for the first time, now that they're in GCC High?
Yeah, it's a great question. Get that all the time. So we typically, pre-stage our data. So take a copy of the source to destination. So it's not like they're coming in with an empty mailbox or no SharePoint. We also usually will move domains depending on your migration type from your source to destination. So their UPN or their login doesn't really change if that's the intended end state. So from that aspect, everything looks the same. The biggest kind of pain point in migrations is always devices and profiles, mail profiles, Office application cache. So there is some rework that needs to be done regarding mail profiles, which can be automated, through group policy or Intune. Some potential Office app cleanup, where your Office application is still trying to hit to commercial because of registry keys and cache in the background, where you have to force it to show up and connect to GCC High. But we have a lot of that stuff we go through in our process, in our migration planning and in our configuration reviews, and to try to alleviate and mitigate some of that.
I know one of the really big ones comes around device joins. So I know like iOS and Android, I think, is there an unenroll and re-enroll activity, or is there a way to migrate that profile, if you will, on those mobile devices?
Yeah, not really a migration path. It's more of an unenroll, re-enroll, unjoined, rejoin, and we have some scripts and some in-house things to help automate that and do it in bulk.
Nice. So that's very useful, because I know the mobile device side's one thing, and then to your point with scripts on the endpoint itself, the Windows workstation, the fact that there is a little bit of a cleaner path there is really nice, because for a long time it was disjoin, rejoin, create a new profile. It could be a 1 to 3 hour exercise per user to get it set up and customized back to what they had before. Yeah, so that's really kind of good to know that the user impact is pretty light. I mean, setting up Office apps, re-enrolling multi-factor, re-enrolling their mobile device, likely they can keep the same profile, which is nice with some modifications there. So, I mean, you're probably looking, 30 minutes, an hour tops for the user to get reset back up. versus the hours it used to take kind of a post-migration world. So that's really good points there. Let's see, I think we have a comment here. What do you think of client-side application level document encryption capabilities like Microsoft double key encryption? Do you think this could be useful for meeting any of the CMMC controls for level 2? This is an interesting question because, Patrick, you deal in the world sometimes of naval nuclear propulsion information. And that's a spicy CUI category there. So out of the gate, you do not need double key encryption to meet CMMC. You can use the native Microsoft private key. If you end up implementing something like double key encryption, you actually look to break some of the functionality. I want to say, Patrick, was around like maybe e-discovery, certain purview capabilities, around DLP maybe, and things like that. Long story short, it's not a bad product. However, there's more targeted use cases for it if you're dealing with higher levels of export control like NNPI. Patrick, do you have any extra comments around that particular product?
Yeah, I think what I'd say there is there's kind of two variations there. I think what we see a little more often is customer key. So, the ability for you to hold the encryption keys for your data at rest, such that if you were to walk away from the platform, that tenant goes opaque. You can essentially take your data and your encryption keys and know that all of that data left with you. With some CUI specified, you mentioned UNMPI, we see that as a requirement. I think double key encryption is generally more like if you don't want Microsoft to reason over the data itself, you've got actually two keys at a data protection level. We've seen it, used, but like Daniel said, nothing specific there around CMMC level 2.
Oh, we got a little bit of a troller here. Thank you for that, Patrick. One Shane Shipley has dropped a comment here. Shane, I think today, if I saw correct, is your work anniversary of like a gajillion years here at Summit 7. Was it like 15 or 17 or something wild? Anyways, thanks for joining us, Shane. He was also on the live stream when I was in the process of getting hoodwinked with a phishing call, which was also a very fun episode to watch. Vadim, how many companies has Summit 7 migrated into GCC High? What is the largest one your team has completed?
Oh, that's a great one. We'd have to go back and look at the archives. Hundreds, maybe thousands before my time. I know Summit 7's been around for a long time. I've been here for about 5 years. So the largest migration, I think Shane and I did, it was like 20-some thousand.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
So all the way from the mom and pop migrations to the big boy enterprises. What's funny is pretty much everyone asks the same question. It's just how many cooks do you have in the kitchen is usually what has to scale at those levels. So Shane, happy work anniversary, my friend. And thanks for the question there. All right. Speaking of that, Shane, you actually wrote a blog about this that we're going to share here in chat around either phased or all-in migrations. And generally, can I break my migration into multiple weeks? So the larger the organization, the more typical this ask is, right? They don't want to impact, let's say you have 1,000 people and you don't have the internal staff to support kind of the day one activities after you've migrated to GCC High. So a lot of times the questions come up, Daniel, can I just, do 251 week and then wait a week and then another 250, then wait a week, and then all the way until I'm done with 1,000. And I wish it was as simple as people would explain it to me, because sadly it is not. Vadim, when we're talking about kind of the all-in migration, or the big bang, which is cutting everybody over on a single weekend, versus this phase migration where you do like a subset of people over multiple weeks typically. Pros, cons, why shouldn't they do it? Why should they consider it or not consider it? Any feedback on that?
Yeah, definitely. We've been through several of these, tried and true, and I think Shane's blog came out of a lot of that. So for the pros, I would say, from a phase perspective, I'm going to reference Shane's blog because it's all the things that we've been through and banging our heads against. For the pros perspective on the phase, you have some pilot testing. You can kind of test the waters before you go in. There is potentially less business disruption when going through these phase migrations because you're doing chunks, in departments or chunks of your business unit. From a con perspective, now we're looking at multiple identities. We have a user in the source, we have a user in the destination. Are they using browsers to handle the different sessions? Is one using the Office desktop app? So that's one of the big ones, the big impacts that people have to understand and go through. From the con perspective as well, there's a data integrity piece that we need to look at, right? So people can, when they get migrated over, they can start trying to use their SharePoint site in the destination, while also people in the source are using the same SharePoint site. And when we do true ups, we have some data inconsistencies. Which one is the source of truth at that point in time? From the single event migration, some of the pros I would say is obviously a single identity. You stay with your identity. You have a smoother collaboration. So when we talk about shared spaces, SharePoint, Teams, M365 groups, most of the time companies don't have good boundaries, between those. It's not just a certain business unit that uses this group. It could be multiple groups. So it's kind of hard to pluck those M365 groups or sites out and do that first wave of migrations. I don't know, Patrick, we've been through that. We've had some PTSD with that. It's just, there's no good lines to draw that. And
it feels like when you take like a person, a user, and you take like their mailbox and their OneDrive, and you're simply, lifting it to the other tenant. One day they're accessing it in, the source tenant, and the next day they're accessing it in the destination. That works fine with the phased approach, but it's really hard when you look across sites and libraries and folders and teams to paint clear lines around different collaborative groups. And so you oftentimes end up in a case where if you go that phased approach, you've got, essentially like shared spaces that got cut over into the new environment, but now you've got a few kind of edge cases in the source where they still have access to that container. They're still trying to collaborate, but you've got some users that aren't there. So it's real hard to get clean lines between who collaborates where. And if a phase migration drags on for a long period of time, that can get harder. So we tend to go more the fixed forward, single event cutover approach.
Because it's going to be painful either way, is what I'm hearing. It's like if you do a single event, you're going to cut over. There's going to be a load of support tickets you probably have to get through for the first, let's say, couple weeks, right? And this is really just kind of user specific things that need to be tweaked for them. The data's there, all of the base stuff's already there, right? It's just, personalization, I'll call it, for a lot of it. Or you can spend multiple weeks having to figure out, I've got to invite Joe from GCC High because he's in there to our SharePoint side in commercial. I'm going to be in commercial for the next 2 weeks, but I need him to co-write this proposal with me. It's like, that just seems like more of a support nightmare than just dealing with the single event.
Yeah, from an administrative and management also, there's a lot of duct tape and bubblegum solutions that either we or the client have to put into place. Forwarding, gal syncs. How does that going to work? How is a person going to jump into a room and book a room from the other site? How are they going to share calendar permissions if they're already in the destination? So there's a lot of things that you have to consider when looking at a phase migration.
Yeah. Oof. God bless anyone who tries that, because in our experience, that has been a little bit of a train wreck. But we also get, when you're working with 40, 50,000 users, there can be some required concessions because of that. Hopefully those can be overcome for the sake of your support team's just pure sanity, quite honestly. Thank you for that, Vadim. And the blogs in chat, if anyone's curious on that, a very well-written blog. We've got a comment here. Are you starting to define the company size where the cost does not make financial sense to pursue CMMC L2 certification? It's funny you asked me this question, because this morning I recorded a podcast with an individual named Jeff Smedley, who is a CIO or was a CIO. He actually just retired. And we were talking about this exact thing. I think that episode will come out in a couple of weeks, but the short answer is yes and no. If DoD, and it's more revenue driven. So if your top line DoD revenue is more than 10 to 15%, you probably want to keep that business, right? Now, I know that's different for a small business from a percentage perspective to a large business, but usually if we're in the 10 to 15%, we need to keep that for the sake of employment of some of our people, right? If you're below that, you can probably try and drum up more commercial work to offset sunsetting your defense work, right? In downturns in the economy, a lot of people turn back to federal work, right? When the commercial sector starts winding down. And so just knowing that you might not have that option moving forward is a little bit concerning. But what I was telling Jeff, and Jeff and I were talking about on the podcast that we recorded, was you really have to understand that if you plan to not pursue CMMC, I'm trying to say this delicately, and a lot of your business is defense related, there's only a handful of plays you have. Divesting that part of the business immediately, because if you don't do it before CMMC actually hits, the valuation of your company is going to fall dramatically because you don't have that certification. And so this is not like a fear, uncertainty, and doubt. This is just reality of if you're a manufacturer, for example, if you're a 50-person manufacturer and 30% of what you do is defense, your revenue is going to take a dip if you decide not to pursue CMMC for that defense-related work. Now, how much in year 1 versus year 2 versus year 3, that's undetermined. But your valuation is going to go down if you cannot pursue contracts that require a certification. So what I would do if I were you, I would sit down, I would look at 2 things. The rolling 12 months of revenue, direct or indirect from defense work. And then I would look at your BD sales pipeline and understanding how much of your future work is going to be derived from potential defense work. And if that number can be offset by commercial, pivoting to more commercial work, then I would say probably take a look at that. If you're so far into defense and don't want to pivot, then at that point, you really need to sit down and run the numbers and figure out what do we have to do to keep this. I'll even go as far as saying we've talked to insurance brokers and companies and even banks, and they're starting to put systems in place on their side where if you are a defense contractor, even in part, there's going to be contingencies of certification or pursuit of certification for them to release either cyber insurance or actual loans to help you in that journey. So anyways, it's going to be really, really difficult. But there is no like bar, right? It's more percentage driven typically. Again, 10 to 15% can typically, traditionally be offset by other business. If it's more than that, you really need to make and have some real strong considerations about what to do there. And potentially sell off that before CMMC hits so you can actually, maximize your return on that business that you have. So hope that was somewhat helpful. I wish it was an easier conversation than that, to be quite honest. The companies that get certified are going to grow from small business to medium to large businesses because there's going to be a lot of work, because CMMC will also apply to set-asides. And if you're one of the few companies that have set-asides, guess what? You're going to be able to rake in a fair amount of dollars. Where on the other side is if you decide not to pursue this, then you need to assume over at least the next 12 to 36 months, that work will end up drying up. And I don't know what that does to your business as a whole. And so, yeah, this is a very real thing. It's going to be, I've said this many times, it's going to be the largest single consolidating event of the supply chain I think that anyone's ever seen. I mean, I think we could probably go from 300,000 companies supporting the DIB it would not shock me if we're down below 100, down below 50,000 by the end of this over the next 3 years. It's going to be more dramatic than I think anyone is anticipating it to be. So, yeah, have those conversations internally. When this thing hits off, it's going to be a bloodbath. And if you're ready for it, if you're an early adopter, if you're certified, if you're going through certification and you have a date set in mind, good for you. Be prepared to pick up a lot more business. Bruce, I think you had a comment on that. Between 10 to 50%, that's a much lower than previous discussion, which was greater than 30%. Yeah, I mean, 10 to 15%, usually that percentage, again, you can pick up other lines of work commercially, or maybe through other federal agencies. Now, CMMC-ish is coming through the FARS CUI clause, so you're not going to be able to hide from that standard for a long time. But yeah, I mean, 10 to 15%, after you've eclipsed that, to your point, Bruce, after you eclipse that 10 to 15%, it's probably hard to find that much other work to supplement your defense. And that would be, very, very problematic. And that's when you have to honestly take the work seriously or sell off that defense line and then try and pick up, commercial to some extent. So thanks for, I saw you agree here. Awesome. Thank you, sir. Another question, are there any good case studies about security events requiring reporting to the DoD? I'm preparing for our annual table talk and would like a practical example other than a hacking attempt. Oh, that's a great question. I am not aware of any public disclosed outside of the Sea Dragon case that happened, which I think was North Korea, maybe. It could have been China. Somebody infiltrating the supply chain and then being able through, I don't know if it was ransomware or through what it was, able to pull out like a bunch of hypersonic nuclear or hypersonic missile type technology. I forget exactly what it was, but I would definitely play the sleeper cell, I think somebody mentioned in here earlier, or ransomware attack simulation. I know of a company that was hit with ransomware that had a military contract and they stole like terabytes of data. And yeah. So anyways, FBI had to get involved. The DoD had to get involved, all sorts of stuff. Ransomware seems to be the way that they're primarily doing that these days. So good question, Nicholas. Jacob, banana, per always. Hope you're having a great PTO time. I know you can't, you tell me when I go on vacation, I can't tune in, I can't participate. Here you are in chat. This is me hoping you're having a great PTO, playing some rounds of golf, getting refreshed. Speaking of that, Jacob's also out next week, but so am I because it's July 4th. So just FYI on that side, we will not be having the Q&A next week here. All right, Michael, regarding migrations from commercial GCC High, one good resource is the Microsoft roadmap because it allows you to select the platform to see if a critical feature exists. You are absolutely right. The question about that is sometimes they will have things on there that they hope that, will hit a certain GA date, but a lot of times slide to the right. Patrick, I think you've seen this. Vadim, you've probably seen it. Mm-hmm. So if it's not already stated as GA inside of the roadmap, I would not hang my hat that will be ready by the time of your migration. I had somebody ask me the other day, Daniel, is Viva engaged there or Yammer? And I was like, number one, you're only like the third company in the history of the 7 years I've worked here that have asked me about that. But I was like, it's not there. And we went to the roadmap, Michael, and it wasn't even on the roadmap at all. So it's like, yeah, let's make sure that you're finding a third-party product to offset that because it will not be inside of GCC High, at least anytime soon. So,
yeah, Michael, that's a great point, and agree. I have that link on my bookmarks here. Another thing that I do also is when I'm comparing between Gov and commercial is just, you can Google, Microsoft Forms service description or any kind of Microsoft service, and they'll usually give you kind of a breakout and a matrix on what exists in commercial, what exists in GCC High. Usually, there's going to be some that are not in the other. So just a nugget of wisdom there as well.
Always good little life hacks there.
Yeah, there's some good Gov service descriptions out there, but like always, it's a kind of a trust but verify situation. There's a lot of things that hit GA where the the feature set's there. It is live. It is generally available, but some nuance of it may be absent in GCC High in a way that you might not have been expecting. So but we often do a lot of testing with all of that.
Couple good ransomware. Again, another possible tabletop, a compromised MSP, ESP, if you're doing your tabletop exercises. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of MSPs out there. We saw it with SolarWinds, which is more product-based, but there's a lot of tools and people involved in MSPs and ESPs, and to have them be compromised. I mean, one MSP could have 100, 200, 300 clients. So if I were, a foreign adversary, I'd want to attack an MSP, right? So another good thing, not that CMMC certifies that somebody is secure, but it's at least a good understanding of the practices they have in place, or some sort of validation against your MSP, and then also running a tabletop saying, what happens if you guys get compromised, right? To somebody's point above, that's when double key encryption might be helpful, right? If a ransomware attack were to happen, double key encryption would make sure that that data is kept confidential, which is the whole reason that we're here with the CMMC program, confidentiality. So, Jacob, it looks like you're on the tee box. Thought you'd stop by. Shoot a good round for me, my friend. It is 90 something degrees here. I'm assuming you're probably still in California somewhere where it's nice. Please send some of that our way down here. So, and then Jason, agree on the consolidation, but wait until the FARS CUI clause goes into effect and other executive branch agencies adopt CMMC. What Jason's talking about was basically, have you come up with a number where you probably want to exit the DoD if you have this much work tied to them? That's a previous conversation that we just had. Yeah, so FARS CUI is going to expand CMMC to the larger federal contracting base, not CMMC by name, but the same requirements. So FedRAMP clouds, NIST 800-171, incident response, at least in the proposed rule, was actually more dramatic than what the DoD has. It was 8 hours versus the 72 hours that the DoD has. And then it would leave every agency up to their own discernment on if they want to require third-party certification or just self-attestation. So the DOE, right, or DHS might finally decide, hey, that CMMC thing certifies against all these things. Why don't we have them being our certifying body as well? And so it's very likely, because the DoD is one of the largest supply chain managers, I'll call it, in the federal government. As the DoD goes, other agencies are very likely to go because the infrastructure is set up, and chances are they share a lot of the same suppliers in the work they do, right? NASA, DHS, Department of State, so forth and so on. So yeah, I agree with you, Jason. It's only a matter of time that if you're doing federal work, period, you're going to face some sort of cyber regulation over the next 24 months. It's very unlikely you're going to be able to run from it. All right. Jacob Hill, according to my very scientific poll, most people believe that the CMMC DFARS 7021 rule is coming out in September. Yep, September is what we've heard for anticipation of an October go live, which begins the new fiscal of the DoD and the federal government as a whole. So yeah, I mean, it's going to be right there. And once that's there, they can start putting it into solicitations. I know we say this all the time, and people think that we're crying wolf every year that we've said it, but this is 2 steps away from becoming finalized. And this is the closest it's ever been. And if you're hedging your bet that Doge was going to kill it, or that an executive order was going to kill it, or fill in the blank, none of that has happened. There's nothing on the horizon that would stop this. And so just be prepared, because once it hits, you're going to start seeing it. And your primes are probably already starting to communicate this to you. If not, what we've seen and what we've heard from procurement managers and supply chain managers is that you're probably not as critical to their execution of contracts as you might think that you are. So it's worth raising your hand and just asking the question if you haven't heard from them on where their internal rollout sits of CMMC to their suppliers, not necessarily direct from the DoD. All right, Shane, coming back with another question. You are migrating between 2 CMMC compliant systems. Do you use a FedRAMP tool? The answer to that is yes. If the goal of protecting CUI is to protect it while it's under your custody, I will say, then yes, you will need to use a compliant migration tool to go from one CMMC compliant system to another if it is a cloud-based migration tool. If it is not, then you would then be in violation of being able to protect that CUI, which is problematic. A lot of people don't think about that when they're doing acquisitions or M&A activity. They think they can use the same tools they use to get there from commercial to the gov cloud. But once you have solidified and even certified that boundary, now you need to use all of the supporting tools that's going to continue to maintain the confidentiality of that controlled and classified information. So that's a good question that a lot of people on the M&A side, they don't quite think about because it's used so infrequently, right? They might have a migration or an M&A activity, twice a year, once a year. But yes, use compliant tools when doing that from one compliance system to another.
We've definitely seen some cases where, especially with a tool that is inherently on a machine or on premises, the notion that, hey, it doesn't have to be FedRAMP. I'm going to be running it from a compliant device, not knowing that migration tooling still phones home to another cloud or caches in a commercial cloud storage. So yeah, it's a great call out.
Yeah, a lot of people think that EDR tool is another common example, endpoint detection and response. They think that that's doing local scanning of the device, not realizing it's doing sandboxing of that in their vendor's cloud to validate, is it malicious, not malicious, looking for signatures, things like that. And that's where people are like, oh, so my EDR instance is actually not compliant. No, the agent installing and what it's doing locally is okay. But because you have those tunnels back to their cloud provider, that's where it all falls apart, because an EDR tool can't pick up if something's CUI or not and only upload non-CUI stuff, right? Which gets really complicated. So boundaries are important, data flows are really important, and then validating what all of these integrations are actually doing. Because to Patrick's point, a lot of times people don't realize the tools actually are reaching back to the cloud and moving some sort of data to and from them. This was a good question. What are some certified tools for some of these activities? So I know we use AvePoint Fly Tool, Vadim, I think is one of them. I'll let you kind of elaborate on that, but they have a FedRAMP version that we leverage for that exact need.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. There's multiple instances of the Fly tool, but yeah, for those type of migration scenarios, we would use the FedRAMP version.
Yep.
Some other tools.
FedRAMP backup tool, I think, too, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. I don't know of a lot of other migration tools specifically that are FedRAMP certified. I think I talked to BitTitan at Ignite, and they were trying to get there, but not yet there. But yeah, from the migration perspective.
So I'll drop this link in chat. Patrick just sent it to me. I've never seen this before. This is from AvePoint. It's their AOSG, basically their options of tooling for government clients or government contractors in this case, how it works, the FedRAMP authorization, where it all applies to. So we'll drop this link here in chat as well, just so you can see how they're actually handling all this in a compliant manner. Thanks for sharing that, Patrick.
Mm-hmm.
All right. We're going through them today. What are common methods to ensure a company's supply chain is compliant with 171? We have been requiring an NDA, ITAR registration, ICP registration, or JCP registration, and completing a self-made attestation form. Is that adequate, especially for Rev 3? So here's where it's going to get a little tricky. When 48 CFR comes out, 32 CFR has already kind of stated what's coming. So when a contract is awarded, you as a prime, you're going to have to collect evidence that the people below you, the subcontractors or suppliers, are truly compliant. Now, if it's just a score, a self-reporting score, you can kind of keep the same program that you have here, right? Collecting a SPURS score that validates, yes, they are meeting a perfect 110 in order to be able to receive the data. If it's a certification, you will likely need to take possession of that certification, or at least know and see that it exists, and you can validate that, yes, it actually is accurate. Because you as a prime will not have access to EMAS, where that certificate is uploaded by the C3PAO, it gets a little bit tricky on how you guys want to handle either storing that certificate for that supplier or putting some kind of validation mechanism where they show it to you and you're able to validate it through some other means. right? It could be that you validate it with their C3PAO, that it was actually accurate and not, a forgery, right? And so there are certain elements you'll have to go a little bit deeper in. ITAR registration is great, the non-US persons piece, right? Assuming that they are controlling that. But yeah, Rev 3 will have a little bit more juice in it from a supply chain management requirement, specifically risk related. Well, as it relates to CMMC, you will have to do just a little bit more to validate your supply chain, again, from a collection of evidence. Nicholas, so effectively ask for a CMMC cert just like you do an ISO. Yes, that's what a lot of organizations and primes are looking to do, just to have those on record. Really, really good question. All right, let's go back to some migration questions here. So what if you use MPIP, Microsoft Purview Information Protection labels in M365 Commercial? Can those be migrated? And bonus question, even if there's encryption or protection applied, can those be migrated, Vadim?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, kind of somewhat new to our space from the tooling perspective. We can migrate MPIP labels, either map them to the same labels that a client has in the source, or we can map them to another label that we would build out as part of our CMMC implementation project. So yes, the tool will handle that. The only asterisk or limitation there is files that are encrypted with passwords and have a label. Those cannot be migrated, unfortunately. The tool can't unencrypt those keys there.
So here's a follow-up to that. Let's say I use a digital certificate for myself, right? And I have an IdenTrust cert, and I've used that to encrypt things in my tenant and commercial. I'm assuming because I'm holding the encryption key, when those things migrate, I'm still going to be able to decrypt those. Is that right with like digital, like CAT cards, PIV cards, things like that? Do you know?
Yeah. If we're talking about like SMIME or email certs, yeah, those, as long as you re-upload that cert back into your Outlook profile, you should be able to continue using that as normal and can see all your old emails and data.
Perfect. And if they were using Azure Rights Management and just a regular Microsoft encrypted email, and Microsoft holds those keys, I don't think there's a way. You can migrate them, but I don't think you can open them because you don't have the key anymore. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. Correct. 100%. Yep. So the key stays in the old source tenant, and there's no way for the tool to read it and bring it over. It can bring over a shell of it, but it'll be, it'll say you don't have permissions or you can't read this email.
So that's a really good thing. So Purview, yes, there are paths for migration, both encrypted and non-encrypted files and tagged items. However, if you're using just the encrypt button on your Outlook emails, because that key stays with the tenant, it cannot be migrated over to GCC High. So make sure to kind of crack those open, run a little search query in your own Outlook. I'm sure there's ChatGPT can help you figure out how to find those encrypted emails. And you probably want to copy and paste the contents of it before your migration, so you can open those back up if you have those. All right. Sandy, you ask, anyone know a way to tell if a CMMC certification is legit? Sadly, no. It's going to have leading indicators like company name, the C3PO that did the assessment, the cage code, things like that. The best thing to validate is, number one, was the cage code accurate? I would hope if they did a spoof, at least that part would be accurate. But number two, on the C3PO side, basically having to get confirmation from them and their legit email domain that yes, this supplier did get a CMMC certification. So between you, the partner you're working with, and their C3PO to validate that is actually accurate. Outside of that, once CMMC certs start floating around on the internet, the magic of Photoshop and AI, I'm sure will magically show up to falsify records, and that's no good. Now, the good news to some extent is if you are a prime, the DoD can validate that because the only way to upload is through EMAS, right? However, from a prime talking to a sub, you can't see that portal, so you're going to have to get a little creative on how you decide to validate if that actually is real or not and is not falsified. That's a really, really good question. All right. We got a lot of links today. So many great links. It's Linkapalooza. This should keep us busy through the July 4th holiday. Yes, Bruce, we like feeding all sorts of fun information to you guys. Does a prime have the ability to dictate if a CDI, cover defense information, is not required on their program containing CUI specified? Yes, you can choose not to flow that down to your suppliers. So not everyone has to meet CMMC level 2 in this case, if it's CUI specified, or CUI in general. You get to control the data flow. However, most times primes are doing CYA, and they're probably just going to require a blanket certification across the board, even though there is control there on who's going to be receiving the actual controlled and classified information. Jacob, to your point, I wish they would issue CMMC certifications as credibly digital badges or something similar. That would make them easily verifiable. I agree. That would have been a fantastic system to put in place where people can validate, yes, sure enough, Joe's Machine Shop is actually certified. However, that's not always the case there. All right, just going through it a little bit. Ooh. CDI meaning CUI designation indicator. Let me look back at the question here. Does a prime have the ability to dictate is not required on their program containing CUI specified? I think I'm misreading the question a little bit. You do have the ability to mark it, and you should mark it if it is CUI. You cannot decide to not mark it if it, you cannot not mark it if it is CUI, if that makes sense. You need to go back to the information owner. If you don't own the information and they need to mark it, that's the way that the process should actually work there. What are our obligations to find and identify legacy CUI that was created prior to the CUI rule being issued? How far back in time do we have to look? This is an interesting question simply because DFARS 7021 will be a net new contractual requirement, and that being the CMMC requirement. And what you're attesting to is that any CUI either received or generated on behalf of that contract is stored in, let's say, the certified boundary, right? However, that does not look retroactively back to all the CUI that you have in your contracts. And so those are still going to be governed by the contractual obligations you had at that time, assuming there was no contract mods to incorporate CMMC later, and you're actually required to manage those to DFARS 7012, and then likely DFARS 7019-20 in the relation to the SPUR score piece as well. But legacy CUI pre-CMMC, should it be protected fully? Absolutely. You have a contractual requirement to do that. However, you also have the ability to submit a imperfect SPUR score for that legacy information. For net new contracts with CMMC with the 7021 clause, you do not have that luxury, and all new CUI will have to be protected in the boundary that you have had, again, I'm using air quotes here, certified that that is the protected space. Good question. Will primes or tier ones allow participating RFQ or RFP with a published SPUR score of 110? Or do we think they'll require certification first? Good question. They will likely let you participate. If there is going to be CUI involved, they might just require a perfect 110. If the solicitation states that a certification will be required at time of contract award, they might require a cert. That's going to be on a prime by prime basis. But if the RFP comes out and says, hey, this thing's going to require a certification, they might require their suppliers to also be certified in order to participate in the bid, because they're going to be the ones executing the work, right? So what good would a company that doesn't have a cert do me in bidding it, because their rates aren't reflective of them paying for a certificate, and then the rates are going to be off, right? So it really is going to be a case-by-case basis, but likely they're going to know that requirement of cert or no cert at the time of the RFP drop, and then from that be able to derive who they can actually work with. And that's probably who they're going to bring into the fold to have those discussions with, to make sure that's being priced out correctly. Good question. All right, let's fire up a couple more migration questions here. What isn't in GCC High that I should be aware of? So we all know that commercial and GCC High, they are different. One is a commercial, one's a sovereign cloud. Many moons ago, the feature parity was abysmal. We can honestly say that because we have lived through it. We migrated on April Fool's Day, by the way, years and years and years ago. We all thought it was a joke. It was not a joke. And but the good news is there is significant improvement in feature parity now. However, there are still things not there. Vadim, do you have, I know you were working on a list at one point. Do you have some of those items of things that aren't in GCC High that people should be aware of, or at least playing around?
Yeah. So one of the hot topic items everywhere, it seems like, is Copilot. So Copilot is not yet in GCC High. They keep saying that it's coming at some point in time soon, but TBD. So
yeah, I think the latest there is end of year from Microsoft.
End of year for Copilot. I kind of say that's a good thing, though, because most people don't have the right governance in place to unleash something like Copilot from what we've seen. But do your due diligence now in protecting that data, correct permissions, groups, all the things before you launch a AI tool against your tenant. Go ahead, Vadim. I think you had some more for us.
Yeah, and a lot of these just are due just because of feature parity with either Microsoft doesn't support them, or it could be potentially a limitation with our tool. But Outlook New, it does not work in GCC High, so that's also TBD. At some point, that'll be functional. There are some limitations with Power Platform, so we can bring a lot of the Power Platform objects over in our migration. There is still some kind of manual spot checking and rework. Some of the items or objects don't come over gracefully, so just stay tuned there. Forms migration, Forms, there's no migration path for that. It's really just a import, export, or rebuild. Recently, we were asked about Fabric, so Microsoft Fabric. Also, I think it's just a limitation in GCC High currently.
And I think forms externally as well for new forms isn't in GCC High yet. So if you're doing like intake forms and things like that, they're just closed to the tenant and the users inside of the tenant environment. And then Jody popped up one. Teams audio conferencing dial-in, also true. Microsoft in the Sovereign Cloud hosts 0 voice services. So you either have to use direct routing implementation or a third-party tool to be able to get that working as well. Good call out there, Jody.
Yeah, a couple other things. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Patrick.
Oh, yeah, just one comment on the external forms. One thing that's interesting there is even if that capability would come to GCC High, what we typically see in external forms is one of these is it's built on top of the anonymous link sharing capabilities of SharePoint Online, such that something you would never want to enable in GCC High in terms of anonymous links and not requiring a guest invitation before someone's able to access content. It's kind of dependent on that. So even if it was supported, it's something that you would likely have blocked with configuration. So.
Yeah, the other two top of mind are just guest users. There isn't really a migration path for guest users. It's just a rebuild and re-invitation process. And then the same for enterprise apps migration. So if you have an SSO app in commercial, it's really just a rebuild, relink, and working with the vendor.
Oh, one bonus round, and we do not play in this space, but it's absolutely true. Dynamics is very limited in GCC High. It's been getting better, but Business Central, which is core to a lot of small business in the manufacturing space, that does not exist in GCC High. There's an Azure Gov infrastructure deployment you can do of it, but the SaaS-ified version is not in GCC High. The minute it does, there's going to be a lot of adopters in our space for the Dynamics piece. That's a good call as well, Bruce. Rock and roll, my friends. There's one other here. Let's see, Michael, GDAP is also not available in GCC High for MSP partner management. Yeah, I know the Lighthouse functionality is limited to GovCloud to GovCloud. The multi-tenant management, Patrick and I were in a meeting this morning talking about how that functionality needs to be there in order for scaling of MSPs to support defense contractors. So yeah, it's a good call out as well, Michael. And all right, with that, my friends, we are a few seconds away from 1 o'clock Central Time, which is where the majority of us here reside. Thanks for joining us today. If you have any questions, feel free to drop another link here. We'll make sure to get those at another time. And have a happy 4th. We will not be live streaming there. Patrick and Vadim, thanks for joining us. And everyone have a great weekend.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.